The sound of police sirens pierces through what should have been a perfect family vacation. Marcus Williams, a 45-year black man, stands with his hands behind his back as cold metal handcuffs click around his wrists. His wife Sarah watches in horror, her hands shaking as she tries to shield their two children from the chaos unfolding before them. 16-year-old Emma stands frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief, while 12-year-old Jake clings to his mother's arm, tears streaming down his face. This isn't some rundown neighborhood or sketchy part of town. This is happening right outside Pine Lake Resort, one of the most exclusive family destinations in the state, where the Williams family has been staying for what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Officer Reynolds, his face twisted with authority and something much darker, barks out the words that will change everything. "You're under arrest for trespassing and theft." His voice carries across the resort parking lot, drawing stares from other guests who slowly begin to gather, some pulling out their phones, others whispering among themselves. But here's what's absolutely incredible about this moment. While chaos erupts around him, while his children watch their father being treated like a criminal, Marcus Williams remains eerily calm. His voice is steady, almost whisper quiet, as he leans toward his wife and says something that makes no sense to anyone listening. "Call Director Harrison. Tell him Agent Williams needs immediate assistance." Agent Williams? Director Harrison? What could this possibly mean? The officers have no idea who they're really dealing with. The resort staff doesn't know. Even the gathering crowd of onlookers has no clue about the massive mistake that's about to unfold. They see what Officer Reynolds sees, a black family that, in his mind, doesn't belong in this upscale resort. But sometimes, just sometimes, the people who abuse their power pick the absolute wrong target. What happens when racist cops target the wrong family? What happens when they handcuff someone who has dedicated his entire career to upholding the very justice they're trampling on? And what happens when that quiet phone call Marcus just requested sets in motion a chain of events that will expose everything? If you want to see how this incredible story unfolds, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what's about to happen will leave you absolutely speechless. And here's what I want to know from you. Have you ever witnessed or experienced racial profiling like this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because this story is far from over, and it's about to get a whole lot more intense. To understand just how devastating this moment is, you need to know who Marcus Williams really is. This isn't just any father being humiliated in front of his children. This is a man who has spent the last 15 years of his life serving his country as an FBI special agent, investigating the very crimes that Officer Reynolds seems to think he's capable of committing. Marcus didn't grow up with privilege. He wasn't handed anything on a silver platter. Born and raised in one of Detroit's toughest neighborhoods, he knew what it felt like to be looked at with suspicion, to have people cross the street when they saw him coming, to be followed around stores by security guards who assumed the worst. But instead of letting those experiences break him, Marcus used them as fuel. He worked 2 jobs to put himself through college, graduated summa cum laude with a degree in criminal justice, and fought his way through FBI training at Quantico, where he graduated at the top of his class. For 15 years, Marcus has been one of the Bureau's most respected agents. He's taken down human trafficking rings, dismantled drug operations, and put dangerous criminals behind bars. He's received commendations from directors, been featured in FBI training videos, and has saved countless lives through his work. The irony is almost too painful to bear. Here's a man who has dedicated his entire career to fighting injustice, now being treated like a common criminal because of the color of his skin. Standing beside him, watching her husband being handcuffed like some kind of dangerous felon, is Dr. Sarah Williams. Sarah isn't just Marcus's wife. She's one of the most respected pediatric surgeons in the state. She spends her days saving children's lives, working 14-hour shifts in the operating room, earning the trust of families during their darkest moments. Sarah and Marcus met in college, 2 ambitious kids from difficult backgrounds who saw something special in each other. She was pre-med, he was studying criminal justice, and they both shared this incredible drive to make the world better than they found it. Sarah has performed life-saving surgery on over 3,000 children during her career. She's been published in medical journals, has lectured at conferences around the world, and has pioneered techniques that other surgeons now use to save lives. But right now, none of that matters. Right now, she's just a terrified wife watching the man she loves being treated like a threat to society. Their daughter Emma is 16 years old, an honor roll student who carries a 4.0 GPA and has already been accepted to several prestigious universities with full scholarships. Emma isn't just smart, she's passionate about justice. She volunteers at legal aid clinics, participates in Model UN, and has already declared her intention to become a civil rights lawyer. She wants to follow in her father's footsteps, fighting for justice, but through the legal system rather than law enforcement. Emma has grown up hearing her father's stories about his work, about the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect, about how law enforcement should protect and serve all people equally. Right now, Emma is watching everything she's been taught about justice and fairness crumble before her eyes. She's seeing her hero, her role model, being treated like a criminal by the very system he serves. The confusion and anger in her eyes is heartbreaking. This brilliant young woman who has always believed in the system is watching it fail her family in the most public and humiliating way possible. And then there's 12-year-old Jake, the baby of the family who worships his father. Jake plays Little League Baseball, and Marcus never misses a game, even when he's in the middle of a major case. Jake knows his dad is someone important, someone who helps people, but he doesn't fully understand what the FBI does. All Jake knows is that his daddy is the strongest, bravest man in the world, someone who can fix any problem and make everything okay. But Jake's safe world is being shattered. He's watching his hero being treated like a bad guy, and his 12-year-old mind can't process what's happening. The tears streaming down his face aren't just from fear. They're from the devastating realization that maybe his daddy can't fix everything after all. Now let's talk about the people responsible for this nightmare. Officer Reynolds has been wearing a badge for 20 years, and those 2 decades have been marked by a pattern of complaints, accusations, and incidents that would have ended most careers. But Reynolds has always managed to survive, always found a way to explain away his actions, always had someone in his corner protecting him from consequences. Reynolds isn't just a bad cop. He's a dangerous one. He sees successful black families like the Williams as some kind of personal threat, as if their achievements somehow diminish his own worth. Every time he encounters black people who are educated, successful, or wealthy, something inside him rebels against it. He can't accept that they've earned their success through hard work and talent, so he looks for any excuse to tear them down, to remind them of what he sees as their place in society. The complaints against Reynolds read like a handbook on police misconduct. Excessive force against minorities, racial profiling, false arrests, planted evidence. But every time someone tried to hold him accountable, the system protected him. Other officers backed up his stories, supervisors covered for him, the union defended him, and so Reynolds learned that he was essentially untouchable, that he could abuse his power without facing real consequences. Standing next to Reynolds is Officer Martinez, and this is where the story gets even more tragic. Martinez is a rookie, barely 6 months out of the academy. He joined the force because he genuinely wanted to help people, to make his community safer, to be one of the good guys. Martinez comes from a Latino family that taught him to respect all people, to treat everyone with dignity regardless of their background. But Martinez is learning a harsh lesson about police culture. He can see that what Reynolds is doing is wrong. Every instinct in his body is telling him to speak up, to question these arrests, to demand that they actually look at Marcus's credentials. But Martinez has been taught that you never, ever go against a senior officer. You back up your partner no matter what. You present a united front. And so, Martinez stands there, his conscience screaming at him, but his training and fear keeping him silent. The man ultimately responsible for both of these officers is Chief Brewster. a 30-year veteran who has watched his department become increasingly militarized and increasingly hostile toward the communities they're supposed to serve. Brewster represents the old guard, the generation of law enforcement that sees any criticism of police behavior as an attack on law and order itself. Brewster knows about Reynolds' history. He's seen the complaints, read the reports, heard the whispers. But in Brewster's mind, supporting his officers is more important than addressing their misconduct. He's the type of chief who sees settlements paid to victims of police brutality as the cost of doing business rather than warning signs of systemic problems. This entire devastating situation started with a phone call from what police like to call a concerned citizen. But here's what really happened. Someone at Pine Lake Resort saw the Williams family walking through the parking lot after dinner, noticed they were black, and decided they must be up to something suspicious. The caller told police that a black family was acting suspicious near expensive cars in the resort parking lot, implying without any evidence that they were planning to steal something. Pine Lake Resort is supposed to be a sanctuary for families like the Williams. It's an upscale destination where successful people bring their children for weekend getaways, where kids can swim in crystal-clear lakes, where parents can relax and reconnect. The Williams family has been coming to Pine Lake for 3 years running. They have a favorite cabin they always request, staff members who know them by name, and a reservation history that proves they belong there just as much as anyone else. But none of that matters to the person who made that phone call. All they saw was a black family in their space, and they decided to weaponize the police against them. If this story is making your blood boil, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. And what happens next will show you exactly why this case became one of the most shocking examples of racial profiling in recent history. Here's what I want to know from you. How do you think Officer Martinez should handle this situation? Should he speak up against his senior partner, even if it could end his career before it starts? Let me know in the comments, because that moral dilemma is about to become very, very important. Now here's where this story takes a turn that will make your blood absolutely boil. The moment Officers Reynolds and Martinez stepped out of their patrol car, you could see it in their body language, in the way they approached the Williams family, in the assumptions already written across their faces. They didn't arrive as peace officers ready to investigate a situation. They arrived as executioners, having already decided that this black family was guilty of something, and they were just there to figure out what. Reynolds strutted over with that particular brand of arrogance that comes from 20 years of never facing consequences for his actions. His hand was already resting on his weapon, his shoulders squared in an aggressive stance that said, "I'm in charge here, and you people better remember that." Martinez followed behind him, and you could see the uncertainty in his steps, but he was too intimidated by his senior partner to question the approach. The first words out of Reynolds' mouth weren't, "Can I help you?" or "We received a call, is everything okay?" No, his opening line was, "What are you people doing here?" Not, "How can I assist you today?" but "What are you people doing here?" Those 3 words, "you people," told the Williams family everything they needed to know about how this encounter was going to go. Marcus, drawing on 15 years of training in de-escalation and crisis management, kept his voice calm and professional. He slowly reached into his jacket pocket, moving deliberately so no one could misinterpret his actions, and pulled out his federal credentials. This is the moment that should have changed everything. This is the moment when any reasonable police officer would have looked at those credentials, realized they'd made a massive mistake, and immediately shifted their approach. But Reynolds didn't even glance at the badge and identification that Marcus was holding out. He didn't take 2 seconds to examine the federal credentials that would have instantly explained who Marcus was and why he belonged anywhere he wanted to be in the United States of America. Instead, Reynolds waved his hand dismissively and said the words that should have ended his career right there. "Anyone can fake a badge." Think about that for a moment. A 20-year police veteran, someone who should know federal credentials when he sees them, someone trained to verify identification refused to even look at legitimate FBI credentials. This wasn't ignorance. This wasn't a mistake. This was willful blindness, driven by pure prejudice. Marcus tried again, his voice still remarkably steady. "Officer, if you would just take a moment to examine my credentials, you'll see that I'm FBI Special Agent Marcus Williams. My family and I are guests at this resort, and we were simply walking back to our cabin after dinner." But Reynolds had already made up his mind. In his twisted worldview, no black man could possibly be a federal agent, no black family could possibly belong at an upscale resort, and no amount of evidence was going to change his mind. This is what 20 years of unchecked racist behavior looks like: a complete inability to process reality when it conflicts with your prejudices. Meanwhile, Sarah was watching this interaction with growing horror and the instincts of a brilliant surgeon who knows how to document everything. She pulled out her phone and started recording, understanding that this situation was about to get much worse and that they would need evidence of what was happening. The moment Reynolds saw that phone camera pointed in his direction, something inside him snapped. His face turned red with rage, and he started shouting, "Put that phone away. You're interfering with a police investigation." But Sarah, God bless her, knew her rights. She kept filming and calmly stated, "I have the right to record police officers in the performance of their duties. This is a public space, and I am not interfering with anything." This is where you see the difference between someone who respects the law and someone who abuses it. Sarah knew that citizens have a constitutional right to record police interactions. She knew that transparency protects both citizens and good police officers. But Reynolds saw her camera as a threat to his authority, as evidence that could expose his misconduct, and he couldn't tolerate that. Reynolds started advancing toward Sarah, his hand moving toward her phone, clearly intending to seize it. This is when Marcus, despite being handcuffed, positioned himself between his wife and the officer. His voice was still controlled, but you could hear the steel underneath. "Officer, my wife is exercising her constitutional rights. She is not interfering with your investigation. She is documenting your behavior, which is completely legal." But the situation was spiraling out of control, and it was about to get even worse. The resort manager, a man named David Mitchell, came hurrying over from the main building. At first, Mitchell seemed like he might be the voice of reason in this insanity. He approached the officers and said, "Excuse me, officers, but this is the Williams family. They're guests here. They've been staying with us for 3 years. There must be some kind of misunderstanding." For just a moment, it seemed like Mitchell might be able to de-escalate the situation. Here was someone who could vouch for the family, someone who knew they belonged at the resort, someone who could confirm that they weren't trespassing or acting suspiciously. But then Mitchell looked around and saw the growing crowd of onlookers, saw other resort guests watching this confrontation unfold, saw people with their phones out recording everything. And something shifted in his demeanor. The business owner in him started calculating the potential damage to his resort's reputation, started worrying about how this scene might affect his upscale clientele. Instead of standing firm in defense of guests he knew were innocent, Mitchell began to waver. He started speaking more quietly to the officers, clearly trying to distance himself and his business from the situation. You could see him making the cowardly calculation that it was safer to let the police handle this however they wanted, rather than risk being seen as confrontational toward law enforcement. Mitchell pulled Reynolds aside and whispered something that made the officer nod with satisfaction. Later, witnesses would report that Mitchell had essentially given the officers permission to do whatever they felt was necessary to resolve the situation quickly and quietly. The resort manager had just thrown the Williams family under the bus to protect his business interests. This betrayal hit the family particularly hard because they had developed a relationship with the resort staff over their 3 years of visits. Jake especially loved talking to the groundskeepers about the lake, and Emma had befriended some of the younger staff members. To see the manager abandon them in their moment of greatest need was devastating. But the worst was yet to come. Emma, watching her father being treated like a criminal, watching her mother being threatened for exercising her rights, watching the resort manager betray their family, finally reached her breaking point. This brilliant 16-year-old, who had spent her life believing in justice, who had been raised to speak up when she saw something wrong, couldn't stay silent anymore. Emma stepped forward, her voice clear and strong despite the fear you could see in her eyes. "Officer, you're making a terrible mistake. My father is FBI Special Agent Marcus Williams. If you would just look at his credentials, you would see that he's telling the truth. We're not criminals. We're a family on vacation." Reynolds whirled around to face this teenager, who dared to question his authority. His face was twisted with rage as he pointed his finger at Emma and shouted, "You need to step back right now, young lady, or you're going to find yourself in handcuffs too for interfering with a police investigation." The threat to arrest a 16-year-old honor student for speaking up in defense of her father was the moment this situation crossed from misconduct into something truly evil. Emma wasn't interfering with anything. She wasn't being aggressive or disrespectful. She was simply trying to provide information that could resolve the situation peacefully. But in Reynolds' mind, any challenge to his authority, even from a child, was unacceptable. Sarah immediately moved to protect her daughter, placing herself between Emma and the officer. "She's just a child," Sarah pleaded. "Please don't threaten my daughter. She's done nothing wrong." But perhaps the most heartbreaking moment of all came from 12-year-old Jake. This little boy, who had been watching his hero, his daddy, being treated like a dangerous criminal, finally found his voice. Through his tears, in a voice that broke the hearts of everyone who heard it, Jake cried out, "Why are they being mean to Daddy? Daddy helps people. Daddy catches the bad guys. Why are the police being mean to Daddy?" The innocent confusion in that child's voice captured everything wrong with this situation. Here was a 12-year-old boy who had been raised to respect law enforcement, who had been taught that police officers were the good guys, trying to understand why these officers were treating his father like a villain. Jake's question hung in the air like an accusation. Why were they being mean to Daddy? Why were officers of the law refusing to look at federal credentials? Why were they threatening to arrest a teenage girl for speaking up? Why were they treating a family on vacation like dangerous criminals? The answer, of course, was racism. Pure, undiluted, systemic racism that had infected every level of this interaction. From the concerned citizen who called in the false report, to Officers Reynolds and Martinez who arrived with preconceived notions, to the resort manager who abandoned his guests to protect his business, to the growing crowd of onlookers who were treating this family's humiliation like entertainment. This is how racism works in America. It's not always burning crosses and white hoods. Sometimes it's a phone call reporting suspicious behavior by people whose only crime is being black in a space where someone thinks they don't belong. Sometimes it's police officers who refuse to examine evidence that contradicts their prejudices. Sometimes it's business owners who choose protecting their image over protecting innocent people. And sometimes it's a crowd of people who watch a family being destroyed and do nothing to help. The Williams family was trapped in a nightmare that was about to get much, much worse. But what none of these officers knew, what the resort manager didn't understand, what the crowd of onlookers couldn't have imagined, was that Marcus's quiet request for his wife to call Director Harrison was about to set in motion a chain of events that would expose this entire rotten system. If you can't believe what you're hearing, if this level of injustice is making you as angry as it should, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're nowhere near the end of this story, and the twist that's coming will leave you absolutely speechless. Here's what I want to know from you. At what point do you think the other resort guests watching this unfold should have spoken up? When does being a bystander become being complicit? Let me know in the comments. Because what happens next is going to test everyone's moral courage in ways they never expected, sink them. If this story is making your blood boil, make sure you hit that subscribe button because we're just getting started. And what happens next will show you exactly why this case became one of the most shocking examples of racial profiling in recent history. Here's what I want to know from you. How do you think Officer Martinez should handle this situation? Should he speak up against his senior partner, even if it could end his career before it starts? Let me know in the comments, because that moral dilemma is about to become very, very important. What happened next will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice in America. Officer Reynolds, emboldened by the resort manager's cowardly surrender and drunk on his own unchecked power, decided it was time to escalate this situation from humiliation to outright brutality. "Spread your legs and put your hands on the car," Reynolds barked at Marcus, his voice dripping with the kind of authority that comes from 20 years of never being held accountable. But Marcus wasn't near a car. He was standing in an open area of the resort parking lot. Reynolds was forcing him to walk over to a patrol car just so he could conduct what would become one of the most degrading searches you've ever witnessed. Marcus, drawing on every ounce of his FBI training and professional discipline, complied without resistance. But what Reynolds did next wasn't a search. It was assault, disguised as police procedure. Reynolds's hands weren't just thorough. They were deliberately rough, invasive, and designed to humiliate. He pressed harder than necessary, lingered longer than required, and made sure that every guest watching understood that this black man was being put in his place. Marcus's wallet was yanked from his pocket and thrown to the ground. His phone was seized and tossed aside like garbage. His jacket was pulled off so aggressively that the fabric tore. And all the while, Reynolds kept up a steady stream of commentary designed to dehumanize Marcus in front of the growing crowd. "Let's see what we've got here. I bet we're going to find something interesting." But here's what makes this even more devastating. While Reynolds was conducting this theatrical degradation, Sarah and the children's belongings were being scattered across the parking lot, like they were evidence from a crime scene. Their suitcases were opened, and their personal items were dumped out for everyone to see. Sarah's medical journals and conference materials were scattered in the dirt. Emma's college application essays and honor roll certificates were trampled underfoot. Jake's baseball cards and favorite stuffed animal were treated like contraband. The message was clear. This family's dignity, their privacy, their basic humanity meant nothing to these officers. They were being treated like criminals caught in the act, despite having done absolutely nothing wrong except exist while black in a space where someone decided they didn't belong. As this degrading spectacle unfolded, more and more resort guests began to gather. What started as a few curious onlookers had turned into a crowd of 30 or 40 people, all watching this family's nightmare unfold like it was some kind of entertainment. And this is where the story reveals something truly ugly about human nature, because the crowd's reactions split along predictable and heartbreaking lines. Some guests, to their credit, were clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. You could see it in their body language, the way they shifted nervously, the way they whispered to each other, the way some of them pulled out their phones to record what was happening. These were the people whose consciences were screaming that something was terribly wrong with this picture. But then there were the others, the guests who nodded approvingly as they watched Marcus being searched. The people who whispered comments like, "I knew something was off about them," and "you can't be too careful these days," and "good thing someone called the police." These were the people whose racism was being validated by what they were witnessing, who saw this family's humiliation as confirmation of their own prejudices. One particularly vile guest, a middle-aged white woman in expensive resort wear, actually said loud enough for the family to hear, "I don't care if they have reservations. People like that don't belong in a place like this. They're probably using stolen credit cards anyway." Another guest, an older white man with a golf shirt and the kind of entitled swagger that comes from a lifetime of privilege, chimed in. "I've been coming to this resort for 15 years, and it's never been the same since they started letting in just anybody." These comments weren't whispered. They weren't said quietly or with any shame. They were said at full volume, intended for the Williams family to hear, designed to remind them that in the minds of these people, they were unwelcome intruders who deserved whatever was happening to them. But the most chilling comment came from a woman who was recording the whole thing on her phone, not out of concern for justice, but as entertainment. "This is going straight to my Facebook. My friends are not going to believe this." Meanwhile, Sarah continued trying to document this injustice with her phone, understanding that video evidence might be the only thing that could protect her family. But Reynolds had been watching her, and his rage at being recorded finally boiled over. "Give me that phone right now," Reynolds shouted, lunging towards Sarah with an aggression that made several witnesses step back in shock. Sarah tried to protect her phone, not because she wanted to interfere with police work, but because she knew that video might be the only evidence of what was really happening. "I have the right to record this interaction," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear you could hear underneath. "This is a public space, and I am not interfering with your investigation." But Reynolds wasn't interested in constitutional rights or proper procedure. He grabbed Sarah's phone with such force that he nearly knocked her to the ground. "This phone is evidence in a criminal investigation," he declared, which was complete nonsense since no crime had been committed and no actual investigation was taking place. The seizure of Sarah's phone sent a clear message to everyone watching. The police could take your property, violate your rights, and destroy evidence of their own misconduct, and there wasn't a damn thing you could do about it. This wasn't law enforcement. This was state-sanctioned terrorism. At this point, resort manager David Mitchell realized that his earlier attempt to distance himself from the situation had failed spectacularly. The crowd was getting larger, people were recording, and this was quickly becoming the kind of incident that could destroy his business's reputation. So he tried a different approach. Mitchell approached Officer Reynolds with an expression of forced cooperation and said, "Officer, I want to help resolve this situation. I can confirm that the Williams family has been guests at our resort for the past 3 years. They have a current reservation, they've always paid their bills on time, and we've never had any issues with them." For a moment, it seemed like this information might penetrate Reynolds' wall of prejudice. Here was an authoritative figure, the resort manager himself, vouching for the family and confirming that they belonged exactly where they were. Any reasonable police officer would have used this information to de-escalate the situation and apologize for the misunderstanding. But Reynolds had gone too far to back down now. Too many people were watching. Too much of his authority was on the line. And frankly, his racism was too deep-seated to allow facts to change his mind. "I don't care if they've been coming here for 10 years, Reynolds snapped at Mitchell. "Right now, we have credible reports of suspicious activity, and I'm going to investigate thoroughly. If they're innocent, they have nothing to worry about." This response revealed everything wrong with Reynolds' approach. He had started with the assumption that this family was guilty of something, and no amount of evidence to the contrary was going to change his mind. This wasn't an investigation. It was a persecution with a predetermined outcome. Throughout this entire ordeal, Marcus maintained the kind of professional composure that comes from 15 years of federal law enforcement training. On the surface, he appeared calm, measured, cooperative. He answered questions politely, followed instructions without resistance, and did everything possible to de-escalate the situation. But if you looked closely, really closely, you could see the cost of maintaining that composure. You could see it in the slight tremor in his hands as he was being searched. You could see it in the way his jaw clenched when Reynolds made particularly degrading comments. You could see it in his eyes when he looked at his terrified children and humiliated wife. Because while Marcus was standing in that resort parking lot being treated like a criminal, his mind was being flooded with memories he had spent decades trying to process. Memories of being 7 years old in Detroit, watching his father get pulled over for driving while black, and being made to lie face down on the pavement while officers searched their car. Memories of being 14 and having police officers assume he was a gang member because he was a tall, black teenager walking through his own neighborhood. Memories of being 18 and having his college acceptance letter questioned by a police officer who couldn't believe a black kid from his neighborhood had earned a scholarship. These weren't just memories, they were scars. Psychological wounds that had shaped Marcus's entire worldview and driven him to pursue a career in federal law enforcement, where he thought he could make a difference, where he thought the system might be better, where he thought his badge and his service might protect him and his family from exactly this kind of treatment. But standing there in handcuffs, watching his wife lose her phone and his children lose their innocence, Marcus was learning that no amount of service, no level of achievement, no federal badge could protect a black man from the racism embedded in American policing. The system he had devoted his life to serving was now destroying his family, and there wasn't a damn thing his 15 years of experience could do to stop it. In the middle of this nightmare, 16-year-old Emma Williams did something that will restore your faith in the next generation. While the adults around her either participated in or ignored the injustice unfolding before them, this teenage girl decided she had heard enough. When that vile woman made her comment about people like that not belonging at the resort, Emma walked directly over to her. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from growing up in a household that values education, dignity, and moral courage. "Excuse me," Emma said, her voice clear and steady, despite the chaos around her. "I couldn't help but overhear your comment about people like us not belonging here. I want you to know that my father is FBI Special Agent Marcus Williams. He has spent 15 years protecting people like you from the actual criminals who threaten our communities. My mother is Dr. Sarah Williams, a pediatric surgeon who has saved over 3,000 children's lives. I'm an honor roll student who has already been accepted to several universities with full scholarships." The woman's face turned red with embarrassment and anger at being confronted by a teenager. But Emma wasn't finished. "So when you say people like us don't belong here, what exactly do you mean? Do you mean people who serve their country? People who save children's lives? People who excel academically and contribute positively to society? Or do you just mean black people? Because if it's the latter, then you should know that your racism is showing, and it's not a good look." The woman was speechless. Several other guests stopped their conversations to listen to this remarkable teenager eloquently dismantling the racist assumptions that had fueled this entire incident. Some of them actually looked ashamed of their earlier comments. But Emma wasn't done confronting the crowd's complicity. She turned to address the larger group of onlookers. "All of you standing here watching this happen, recording this for your entertainment, making jokes about my family's humiliation, you need to ask yourselves what kind of people you really are. This could be your family tomorrow. This could be your father being searched like a criminal for the crime of existing while black. This could be your mother having her phone stolen by police officers who don't want their misconduct documented." The power and eloquence of this 16-year-old's words cut through the crowd like a sword. Some people actually started to drift away, unable to face the mirror she was holding up to their behavior. Others began to speak up, questioning whether what they were witnessing was really appropriate. But just when it seemed like Emma's courage might turn the tide of public opinion, the situation took another dramatic turn that would make everything infinitely more complicated. A white van with the logo of the local news station pulled into the resort parking lot, and out stepped a reporter and cameraman who had been monitoring police scanner traffic and caught wind of an incident at the upscale Pine Lake Resort. The moment that news camera appeared, everything changed. Reynolds, who had been playing to a crowd of resort guests, was now performing for a much larger audience. The presence of media meant that his actions would be scrutinized beyond this small group of witnesses. But instead of causing him to reconsider his approach, the camera seemed to make Reynolds double down on his aggressive behavior. "Clear this area immediately," Reynolds shouted at the reporter. "This is an active crime scene, and you're interfering with a police investigation." But the reporter, a seasoned journalist named Jennifer Walsh, who had covered police misconduct stories before, knew her rights just as well as Sarah Williams had known hers. "Officer, we have the right to record from a public area. We're not interfering with your investigation. and were maintaining an appropriate distance. The arrival of the news crew also changed the dynamic among the resort guests. People who had been making racist comments suddenly became very concerned about being identified on camera. Others, who had been silent bystanders, began to realize that their inaction was about to be broadcast to the entire community. But for the Williams family, the arrival of media was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it meant that what was happening to them would be documented and potentially seen by people in positions of power who could hold these officers accountable. On the other hand, it meant that their family's worst moment, their children's trauma, their humiliation and degradation, was about to become public entertainment. Marcus, still handcuffed and still being treated like a dangerous criminal, looked at that news camera and realized that his family's nightmare was about to become a national story. Their names, their faces, their trauma would be broadcast into living rooms across the country. His children would have to go to school knowing that everyone had seen their father treated like a criminal. His colleagues at the FBI would see their fellow agent being humiliated by local police officers who refused to acknowledge his credentials. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, and the worst part was that it didn't have to happen. At any point, Officer Reynolds could have looked at Marcus's federal credentials. At any point, the resort manager could have stood firm in defending his guests. At any point, the crowd of witnesses could have demanded that this injustice stop. But none of that happened. Instead, a family vacation had become a national incident, and there was no going back. If you're feeling sick to your stomach watching this family's dignity being destroyed by a system that's supposed to protect them, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is going to shock you in ways you never expected. Here's what I want to know. Do you think the arrival of the news crew will help or hurt the Williams family? Will media attention lead to justice? Or will it just turn their trauma into entertainment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because the next phase of this story is going to test everyone's assumptions about how the system really works. And then, in the middle of this chaos, something happened that would change everything. Marcus Williams, still handcuffed, still being treated like a common criminal, did something that seemed almost impossibly calm given the circumstances. He looked directly at Officer Reynolds and said, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of 15 years in federal law enforcement, "Officer, I'm requesting my right to make one phone call." Reynolds laughed, actually laughed. Here was a man who had just spent the last 20 minutes refusing to look at federal credentials, illegally seizing phones, and threatening to arrest children, and he found the idea of this black man asserting his constitutional rights to be amusing. "Your phone call?" Reynolds sneered. "You think you're under arrest? You haven't seen arrest yet, buddy, but fine, you want to call your lawyer? Go ahead. Won't help you when we find whatever you're hiding." But here's what Reynolds didn't understand, and what was about to make him look like the absolute fool he was. Marcus wasn't asking to call a lawyer. He wasn't asking to call a bail bondsman or a family member who might come pick him up from jail. Marcus Williams was about to make a phone call that would expose just how catastrophically wrong this entire situation had gone. Marcus pulled out his phone, the one device Reynolds hadn't managed to confiscate because it had been in his back pocket during the search, and dialed a number from memory. Not a number most people would recognize, but a number that would be very familiar to anyone who worked in federal law enforcement. The call was answered on the first ring, and what the crowd heard next sounded like gibberish to most of them, but would have been crystal clear to anyone with FBI training. "Director Harrison," Marcus said, his voice steady and professional. "This is Agent Williams, badge number 2847. I'm requesting immediate supervisory assistance under Article 12, Section C of the Federal Agent Protection Protocol. Current location is Pine Lake Resort parking lot. Local law enforcement is Code 7, unresponsive to federal identification. Request immediate verification and intervention." Officer Reynolds stood there with his mouth literally hanging open. Officer Martinez looked confused, but suddenly very nervous. The crowd of onlookers had no idea what they'd just heard, but they could tell from Marcus's tone and the specific way he was speaking that this wasn't a typical phone call from a typical suspect. Director Harrison's response was immediate and sharp. "Agent Williams, are you saying local police are refusing to acknowledge your federal credentials?" "Affirmative, Director. Despite multiple attempts to present proper identification, local law enforcement has refused verification procedures and is currently detaining my family under false pretenses." "Stand by, Agent Williams. Federal response is en route. ETA 12 minutes. Marcus ended the call and looked directly at Reynolds, who was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, he had made a very serious mistake. But Reynolds was too far gone, too committed to his narrative, too invested in his authority to back down now. "Nice try," Reynolds said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Anyone can make a fake phone call. You could have been talking to your grandmother for all I know." But while Marcus was making his official call for backup, something else was happening that would prove to be equally important. Sarah Williams, despite having her phone confiscated, had managed to catch the attention of her 12-year-old son Jake, who had been quietly standing near their scattered belongings. Jake, smart kid that he was, had managed to keep his phone hidden in his jacket pocket during all the chaos. It was supposed to be for emergencies only. A rule Sarah and Marcus had established when they'd given him the phone for his 12th birthday. Well, if this wasn't an emergency, what was? Sarah whispered urgently to Jake, "Honey, I need you to send a text message to Uncle Tony. Can you do that for Mommy?" Jake nodded, his hands shaking as he pulled out his small phone and tried to hide it from the officer's view. Sarah quickly dictated a message that Jake typed with trembling fingers. "Uncle Tony, this is Sarah. We're in big trouble at Pine Lake Resort. Police have arrested Marcus and won't look at his FBI badge. We need help immediately." Agent Tony Thompson had been Marcus's partner for 8 years. They'd worked cases together, saved each other's lives, and developed the kind of trust that only comes from facing dangerous situations side by side. Tony was at home, having dinner with his own family, when Jake's text message came through. Tony's blood ran cold as he read the message. He knew Marcus would never use his family to send a false distress signal. He knew that if Sarah was reaching out through Jake's phone, it meant her own phone had been taken. And he knew that if local police were refusing to acknowledge Marcus's federal credentials, then something was very, very wrong. Tony immediately called FBI headquarters and set in motion a response that would arrive at Pine Lake Resort with all the force and authority of the federal government. But that response was still minutes away. And in those minutes, the situation at the resort was about to get much more volatile. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez was watching all of this unfold with growing unease. Martinez had joined the police force because he believed in justice, because he wanted to help people, because he thought law enforcement was about protecting and serving communities. But what he was witnessing didn't look like justice. It looked like harassment. It looked like racial profiling. It looked like everything he'd been taught was wrong with policing. Martinez had noticed things that Reynolds seemed to be ignoring or dismissing. He'd noticed how calm and professional Marcus remained throughout this ordeal. Not the behavior of someone trying to hide criminal activity. He'd noticed the quality of the family's clothing, their articulate speech, their obvious education and refinement. He'd noticed that their belongings, when searched, contained nothing suspicious. Just the typical items any family would have on vacation. And most importantly, Martinez had actually looked at Marcus's federal credentials when Reynolds had dismissed them. Those credentials looked legitimate to Martinez. They had all the right security features, the proper formatting, the correct federal seals. Either they were real, or they were the most sophisticated fakes Martinez had ever seen. Finally, Martinez found the courage to approach his senior partner. "Reynolds," he said quietly, "maybe we should take another look at this guy's identification. Those federal credentials looked pretty authentic to me." Reynolds whirled around, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Martinez, you're a rookie. You don't know the difference between real federal credentials and fake ones. These people are con artists, and if you can't see that, then maybe you're not cut out for this job. But Reynolds, what if he really is FBI? What if we're making a huge mistake here? There is no mistake, Reynolds shouted, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I know a criminal when I see one. These people don't belong here, and I don't care what fake badges they're carrying. Martinez tried one more time. But what about his phone call? He seemed to know specific federal protocols. Maybe we should wait for... Martinez, if you question my judgment one more time, you're going to find yourself writing traffic tickets in the worst part of town for the next 5 years. Now shut up and back me up, or find yourself a new career. The threat worked. Martinez, despite his conscience screaming at him, stepped back and said nothing more. This is how good cops become complicit in bad policing, through fear, intimidation, and a system that punishes officers who speak up against misconduct. But then something happened that neither Reynolds nor Martinez could have predicted. A woman in the crowd, someone who had been quietly watching the entire spectacle unfold, suddenly stepped forward with an expression of recognition on her face. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the parking lot. "I know who that is. That's Agent Marcus Williams from the FBI. I saw him on the news last month." The woman, whose name was Jennifer Coleman, was a retired school principal who made a point of following news stories about local heroes and community leaders. She had a remarkable memory for faces, and she was absolutely certain about what she was saying. "He was featured in a story about breaking up a human trafficking ring," Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger and more confident. "He saved dozens of children who were being trafficked across state lines. He got a commendation from the FBI director. I remember because I was so impressed that we had someone like that working in our area." The crowd began to murmur. People started pulling out their phones, not to record the spectacle anymore, but to search for news stories about Marcus Williams. Within minutes, several people had found articles and videos confirming exactly what Jennifer Coleman had said. "Here it is," called out another guest, holding up his phone. "FBI agent Marcus Williams honored for heroic work in human trafficking case. Look, there's his picture right here." The mood of the crowd began to shift dramatically. People who had been making racist comments earlier suddenly became very quiet. Resort guests who had been treating this like entertainment started to realize they were witnessing something much more serious: the false arrest and humiliation of a genuine American hero. But Officer Reynolds, faced with mounting evidence that he had made a catastrophic mistake, did what cowards always do when cornered. He doubled down. "I don't care what you people think you found on the internet," Reynolds shouted. "Anyone can fake a news story. Anyone can create false articles online. This man is impersonating a federal agent, which is a serious federal crime, and I'm going to make sure he faces the full consequences of his actions." The absurdity of Reynolds' claim was breathtaking. He was suggesting that Marcus Williams had somehow created elaborate fake news stories, planted them on legitimate news websites, and maintained this false identity for years, all as part of some elaborate scheme to... do what? Vacation at a resort with his family? But Reynolds wasn't done making things worse for himself. Sensing that the crowd was turning against him, seeing that his authority was being questioned, watching his narrative fall apart in real time, he decided to make the situation even more volatile. "You know what?" Reynolds announced, his voice carrying that dangerous edge that comes from desperation and unchecked power. "I've had enough of this circus. This entire family is going to be arrested. The woman for interfering with a police investigation and destruction of evidence. The teenage daughter for obstruction of justice. The little boy for being part of a criminal conspiracy." The crowd gasped. Several people actually stepped forward in protest. Even some of the resort guests who had been making racist comments earlier seemed shocked by Reynolds' threat to arrest children. Sarah pulled both of her children closer to her, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. "You cannot arrest our children," she said, her voice shaking with a combination of fear and outrage. "They have done nothing wrong. They are innocent children." But Reynolds was beyond reason now. "Ma'am, you're all part of whatever scam your husband is running here. Impersonating a federal officer is a federal crime, and conspiracy to impersonate a federal officer involves the whole family. So yes, you're all going to jail tonight. Emma, despite her terror, stepped forward to protect her little brother. Officer, you can arrest me if you want, but my brother is 12 years old. He's just a child. He doesn't understand what's happening. Please don't do this to him. Jake, tears streaming down his face, looked up at the man who was threatening to arrest him and asked the question that broke everyone's heart. Mister, what did I do wrong? I just want to go home with my mommy and daddy. This was the moment when Officer Reynolds revealed himself to be not just a racist, not just a bad cop, but a genuinely evil human being. Looking down at this terrified 12-year-old boy, Reynolds said, "You should have thought about that before your family decided to break the law." The crowd was horrified. Even Officer Martinez looked sick to his stomach. Several resort guests were openly expressing their disgust with Reynolds' behavior. The news reporter was frantically taking notes, realizing that she was witnessing something that would dominate headlines for weeks. But Marcus Williams, watching this monster threaten to arrest his children, felt something inside him that he hadn't felt since his childhood in Detroit. For the first time in this entire ordeal, his professional composure began to crack. His voice, when he spoke, carried a cold fury that made everyone around him step back. "Officer Reynolds," Marcus said, and his tone was so controlled, so dangerous, that it was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "You have just threatened to arrest my children, my 12-year-old son and my 16-year-old daughter, for crimes that don't exist, based on evidence you refuse to examine, in retaliation for your own misconduct being exposed." Marcus paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. "I want you to understand something very clearly. I have spent 15 years of my life hunting down people who hurt children. I have dedicated my career to putting monsters behind bars. And right now, you are threatening to traumatize my children because you're too proud, too racist, and too stupid to admit you made a mistake." The parking lot had gone completely silent. Even the news crew had stopped moving, everyone sensing that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in this confrontation. "So here's what's going to happen, Officer Reynolds," Marcus continued, his voice growing even more controlled, even more dangerous. "In about 8 minutes, federal agents are going to arrive at this location. They're going to verify my identity, confirm my credentials, and document every single thing you've done here tonight. And then you're going to face the consequences of threatening to arrest federal agents and their families based on nothing more than your own racial prejudice." Reynolds, faced with Marcus's controlled fury and the growing hostility of the crowd, realized that his authority was evaporating. But instead of backing down, instead of admitting his mistake, instead of trying to salvage what was left of his reputation, Reynolds made the decision that would end his career and potentially land him in federal prison. "I don't care who you think you are," Reynolds snarled. "I don't care who you think is coming to help you. Right now, I am the law here, and you and your family are under arrest for impersonating federal officers, interfering with a police investigation, and resisting arrest. Martinez, call for backup. We're going to need a bigger car to haul all these criminals to jail." The threat to arrest the entire Williams family, including 12-year-old Jake, was the final straw for everyone watching. Resort guests who had been silent began shouting protests. The news reporter started broadcasting live updates. Even some of the staff members who had been hiding in the resort building came outside to see what was happening. But most importantly, the threat to arrest his entire family was the moment when Marcus Williams stopped being a patient federal agent trying to de-escalate a situation and became a father protecting his children from a dangerous predator with a badge. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, if you need to see how this confrontation finally gets resolved, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because what happens in the next few minutes is going to be absolutely explosive. Here's what I want to know from you. At this point, do you think Officer Martinez should risk his career and physically intervene to stop Reynolds from arresting the children? When does the moral obligation to do what's right outweigh the fear of professional consequences? Let me know in the comments, because the next phase of this story is going to test everyone's courage in ways they never imagined. And then, just as Officer Reynolds was about to make the biggest mistake of his miserable career by actually arresting innocent children, the sound that would change everything began echoing across Pine Lake Resort. Sirens. Not one or two, but multiple sirens, growing louder and closer by the second. But these weren't the typical wailing sirens of local police cars. These were the distinctive, urgent tones of federal law enforcement vehicles. The kind of sirens that announce the arrival of people who don't mess around, people who have real authority, people who can end careers and lives with a single decision. Reynolds looked up from where he was reaching for his handcuffs, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. He hadn't called for backup. Martinez certainly hadn't requested additional units. So who was coming, and why did they sound like they were in such a hurry? The first vehicle to screech into the Pine Lake Resort parking lot was a black SUV with federal government plates, followed immediately by two more identical vehicles. All three came to a stop with the kind of precision that spoke of serious training and serious purpose. The sirens cut off simultaneously, but the silence that followed was somehow even more ominous than the noise had been. The crowd of resort guests, who had been treating this family's nightmare like entertainment, suddenly realized they were about to witness something much bigger than a local police incident. Phones that had been recording Marcus's humiliation were now focused on these federal vehicles, everyone sensing that whatever was about to happen would be historic. The driver's door of the lead SUV opened, and out stepped a man who commanded attention just by existing. FBI Director James Harrison was in his late 50s, with silver hair and the kind of presence that comes from 3 decades of federal law enforcement. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing physically, but there was something about the way he moved, the way he surveyed the scene, the way every federal agent around him deferred to his authority, that made it clear this was a man who could destroy lives with a phone call. But Director Harrison wasn't alone. From the passenger side of the same SUV emerged Agent Tony Thompson, Marcus's partner, his face a mask of controlled fury as he took in the scene before him. Tony had worked with Marcus for 8 years, had saved his life on multiple occasions, had been best man at Marcus's wedding, and was godfather to both Emma and Jake. Seeing his partner handcuffed like a common criminal, seeing his godchildren terrified and traumatized, seeing Sarah standing there with tears in her eyes, was pushing Tony to the edge of his professional composure. From the other vehicles came a total of 8 additional federal agents, all of them armed, all of them serious, all of them looking like they were ready to handle whatever situation had required their immediate response. This wasn't a social visit. This wasn't a courtesy call. This was the full weight and authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation descending on Pine Lake Resort to protect one of their own. Officer Reynolds, seeing the federal vehicles and the serious-looking agents, made the same mistake that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. He assumed without evidence. His racist brain, the same brain that had refused to believe a black man could be an FBI agent, now concluded that these federal agents must be arriving to support him, to help him arrest these criminals who had been giving him such a hard time. Reynolds actually puffed out his chest and walked toward Director Harrison with a swagger that would have been comical if it weren't so tragic. "Federal agents, thank God you're here," Reynolds called out. "I've got a family of con artists trying to impersonate federal officers. They've got some pretty sophisticated fake credentials, but I saw right through their scam." Director Harrison stopped walking and stared at Reynolds with the kind of expression reserved for insects that have crawled out from under rocks. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity as Harrison processed what this local police officer had just said to him. "Officer," Harrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had interrogated terrorists and dismantled criminal organizations, "I'm going to need you to repeat what you just said, because I want to make sure I heard you correctly." Reynolds, oblivious to the danger he was walking into, repeated his claim with even more confidence. "This black family over there is running some kind of con game, claiming the father is FBI. They've got fake badges, fake credentials, the whole 9 yards. But don't worry, I've got the situation under control. Been doing this job for 20 years, and I can spot a fake from a mile away. The look that crossed Director Harrison's face was something that everyone who witnessed it would remember for the rest of their lives. It was the look of a man who just heard something so stupid, so offensive, so completely divorced from reality that he was having trouble processing it as actual human speech. Harrison reached into his jacket and pulled out his own credentials. Not the kind of credentials that local police officers carry, but the kind that open doors in the Pentagon, that get phone calls returned from senators, that can mobilize the full resources of the federal government with a single signature. "Officer Reynolds," Harrison said, holding his credentials directly in front of the man's face, "I am FBI Director James Harrison. The man you have handcuffed over there is FBI Special Agent Marcus Williams, one of the finest agents in the Bureau's history, and you have just told me that you think he's running a con game." The blood drained from Reynolds' face so quickly that several witnesses thought he might actually faint. The swagger disappeared, the confidence evaporated, and suddenly he looked like exactly what he was: a small-town police officer who had just made an enemy of one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the United States. But Harrison wasn't finished. His voice, when he continued, carried the kind of cold fury that makes career criminals confess their crimes and hardened agents request transfers to other departments. "Officer Reynolds, you have just arrested one of my best agents and his family. You have handcuffed a federal agent who has served this country with distinction for 15 years. You have threatened to arrest his children, for the crime of being black in a space where you decided they didn't belong." Harrison began walking toward Marcus, his voice growing louder and more authoritative with each step. "You have refused to examine federal credentials. You have illegally seized personal property. You have violated the civil rights of American citizens. And you have done all of this while claiming to represent law and order." By now, Harrison had reached Marcus, and without another word, he gestured to Agent Thompson, who immediately began removing the handcuffs from Marcus's wrists. The moment those metal restraints came off, the moment Marcus was free, his children broke away from their mother and ran to him. Jake reached his father first, throwing his 12-year-old arms around Marcus's waist and sobbing, "Daddy, I was so scared. I thought they were going to take you away forever." Emma, trying to be strong but finally allowing herself to break down, wrapped her arms around both her father and her little brother. "Dad, I'm so sorry this happened to you. I tried to defend you, but they wouldn't listen." Marcus, holding his children close, felt 15 years of federal training and professional composure finally crack. Tears that he had been holding back throughout this entire ordeal began to flow freely as he whispered, "It's okay, babies. Daddy's okay. We're all going to be okay now." Sarah joined the family embrace, and for a moment, the parking lot of Pine Lake Resort became a sanctuary where a family that had been torn apart by hatred and ignorance was finally allowed to heal together. But Director Harrison wasn't done with Officer Reynolds. Not by a long shot. "Officer Reynolds," Harrison continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of federal authority, "I want you to look at this family. Look at Agent Williams, who has taken down human trafficking rings and saved countless lives. Look at Dr. Sarah Williams, who has performed life-saving surgery on over 3,000 children. Look at Emma, an honor student who wants to become a civil rights lawyer. Look at Jake, a 12-year-old boy who plays Little League baseball and whose only crime was trusting that police officers were the good guys." Harrison paused, letting his words sink in, then continued, "This is the family you decided to terrorize. These are the people you decided to humiliate. These are the children you threatened to arrest. And you did it all because they committed the unforgivable crime of being black in America." Reynolds, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake, tried to mount some kind of defense. "Director Harrison, sir, I was just doing my job. We received a call about suspicious activity, and I was investigating. I had no way of knowing." "Stop." Harrison's command cut through Reynolds' explanation like a knife through paper. "Just stop talking. You had every way of knowing. Agent Williams showed you his federal credentials multiple times. You refused to look at them. You refused to examine them. You refused to verify them. You made a conscious choice to ignore evidence because it didn't fit your racist assumptions about who could and couldn't be a federal agent. Agent Thompson, who had been watching this exchange while staying close to his partner and godchildren, finally spoke up. Reynolds, Marcus tried to show you his credentials at least 4 times. I know because I've worked with him for 8 years. And I know how he handles situations like this. He's the most professional agent I've ever worked with, and you treated him like garbage. But Director Harrison wasn't done exposing the depth of Reynolds' misconduct. He gestured to one of his agents, who immediately approached with a tablet computer. Officer Reynolds, while you were busy violating civil rights, my agents were reviewing the security footage from this resort. Would you like to see what Agent Williams and his family were actually doing when your concerned citizen called in their report? The tablet screen showed crystal clear footage of the Williams family walking peacefully through the resort parking lot after dinner. Marcus was holding Jake's hand while Emma and Sarah walked beside them, laughing at something Jake had said. They paused briefly near their rental car to let Jake tie his shoe, then continued walking toward their cabin. This is your suspicious activity, Officer Reynolds, Harrison said, his voice dripping with contempt. A family walking to their cabin after dinner, a father holding his son's hand, a mother laughing with her daughter. This is what you decided required aggressive police intervention. The security footage made Reynolds' actions look even more inexcusable than they already had. Here was video proof that the Williams family had been doing absolutely nothing wrong, nothing suspicious, nothing that could justify even the most routine police contact, let alone the nightmare they had been subjected to. But Harrison had one more revelation that would expose the true depths of the racism that had fueled this incident. And speaking of your concerned citizen, Officer Reynolds, let me tell you about the person who made that initial phone call. Her name is Margaret Whitfield, age 67, and this is the 14th time in the past 2 years that she has called police to report suspicious activity by black families in upscale locations. The crowd gasped. Even some of the resort guests who had been making racist comments earlier looked shocked by this revelation. Harrison continued. Ms. Whitfield has called police on black families at restaurants, shopping malls, golf courses, and hotels. In every single case, the families were doing exactly what they appeared to be doing, enjoying their lives as law-abiding American citizens. She is what we in law enforcement call a serial false reporter, someone who weaponizes police departments to harass minorities. The revelation that this entire incident had been triggered by a known racist with a history of false reports made Reynolds' actions look even worse. Not only had he failed to verify the family's credentials, he had also failed to verify the credibility of the person making the accusation. But here's the most damning part. Officer Reynolds, Harrison said, his voice now carrying the cold fury of someone who had seen enough injustice for one lifetime. Miss Whitfield's previous false reports are in your department's system. You could have checked her history with a simple computer search. You could have discovered that she has never, not once, made a legitimate complaint about suspicious activity. But you didn't check, did you? Because checking would have required you to consider the possibility that this black family might be innocent. Reynolds was now visibly shaking, understanding that his career was over and that he might be facing federal charges. But his humiliation was about to get even worse. Just as Director Harrison was finishing his devastating critique of Reynolds' conduct, another vehicle pulled into the resort parking lot. This one was a local police cruiser with Chief emblazoned on the side, and out stepped Chief Brewster, the man ultimately responsible for Reynolds' 20-year career of misconduct. Chief Brewster took one look at the federal agents, the news cameras, the crowd of witnesses, and the handcuffed family that was now embracing freely, and immediately understood that his department was facing a public relations disaster of epic proportions. But rather than taking responsibility for his failure to control Reynolds, rather than acknowledging the systemic problems in his department, Chief Brewster immediately threw his officer under the bus in the most cowardly way possible. "Director Harrison," Brewster said, approaching with his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, "I want you to know that Officer Reynolds' actions tonight do not reflect the values or training of our department. We have had ongoing concerns about his judgment, and this incident will be thoroughly investigated." The lie was so blatant, so obviously self-serving, that several people in the crowd actually laughed out loud. This was the same Chief Brewster who had protected Reynolds for 20 years, who had covered up his misconduct, who had ignored complaint after complaint about his racist behavior. Director Harrison stared at Chief Brewster with the same contempt he had shown Reynolds. "Chief Brewster, Officer Reynolds has been the subject of 47 complaints during his career, 12 of which specifically alleged racial bias. Your department has sustained exactly 0 of those complaints. So please don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is an isolated incident." Brewster's face turned red with embarrassment and anger at being called out so publicly, but he knew he was in no position to argue with an FBI director who had all the facts at his disposal. The confrontation had reached its climax. Reynolds stood exposed as a racist who had abused his power. Chief Brewster was revealed as a coward who protected bad officers until it became politically inconvenient. The Williams family was vindicated and reunited, and the entire crowd of witnesses had learned a valuable lesson about the reality of racism in American law enforcement. If you're feeling the satisfaction of finally seeing justice served, if you want to see how this incredible story concludes and what happens to Officer Reynolds, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because the resolution of this case is going to restore your faith in the possibility of accountability. Here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Chief Brewster should face consequences for protecting Reynolds all these years, or is throwing Reynolds under the bus enough? Should supervisors be held accountable when they enable bad officers? Let me know in the comments, because the final chapter of this story addresses exactly that question. The moment of justice that everyone had been waiting for finally arrived, and it was as swift and decisive as it was satisfying. Director Harrison, having exposed Officer Reynolds for the racist fraud he was, nodded to Agent Thompson, who immediately stepped forward with federal handcuffs. "Officer Reynolds," Harrison announced, his voice carrying across the parking lot for everyone to hear, "you are under arrest for violation of federal civil rights under Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Criminal Code, abuse of power under color of law, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to deprive citizens their constitutional rights." The sight of Reynolds being handcuffed by federal agents was a moment of poetic justice that sent a ripple of satisfaction through the crowd. Here was a man who had spent 20 years abusing his authority, who had terrorized countless innocent people, who had hidden behind his badge while destroying lives, finally facing the consequences of his actions. But Harrison wasn't finished reading the charges. "You are also charged with obstruction of justice for refusing to acknowledge federal credentials, theft of personal property for illegally seizing phones and belongings, and making terroristic threats against minor children. Each of these charges carries a potential sentence of up to 10 years in federal prison." Reynolds, the same man who had been so arrogant and confident just minutes earlier, was now shaking visibly as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The irony was not lost on anyone present. He was being arrested using the same procedure he had used to humiliate Marcus Williams, except this time it was justified, legal, and long overdue. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Thompson continued, his voice professional but cold. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you." As Reynolds was being led away to a federal vehicle, something remarkable happened. Officer Martinez, the rookie who had spent this entire ordeal watching his conscience battle with his fear, finally found his courage. He approached Marcus Williams with tears in his eyes and did something that shocked everyone present. "Agent Williams," Martinez said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I owe you and your family the deepest apology a human being can offer. I knew what Reynolds was doing was wrong, I could see it, I could feel it in my gut, but I was too scared to speak up. I was too worried about my career, too intimidated by his threats, too cowardly to do what I knew was right. Marcus, still holding his children close, looked at this young officer who was genuinely remorseful and saw something he recognized: a good person who had been trapped in a bad system. "Officer Martinez," Marcus replied, his voice gentle but firm, "the fact that you can recognize your mistake and apologize for it tells me that you might actually be one of the good ones. But apologies aren't enough. If you really want to make amends, you need to commit to never letting something like this happen again." Martinez nodded vigorously. "Sir, I swear to you, on my honor as a police officer and as a human being, that I will never again stand silently while someone abuses their authority. I will report misconduct when I see it, even if it costs me my career. I will speak up for victims, even if it makes me unpopular with other officers. What happened here tonight can never happen again, and I'm going to make sure of that." The exchange between Marcus and Martinez was a powerful reminder that not all police officers are bad, but that good officers have a responsibility to stand up against the bad ones. Martinez's commitment to change, born from witnessing this injustice, offered hope that the system could reform itself from within. Meanwhile, resort manager David Mitchell, who had initially supported the family before cowardly abandoning them when things got difficult, realized that his reputation and his business were in serious jeopardy. Every major news outlet in the state would be covering this story, and his resort would forever be known as the place where an FBI agent and his family were terrorized by racist police officers. Mitchell approached the Williams family with an expression of genuine shame and regret. "Agent Williams, Dr. Williams, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am for what happened here tonight. When I first saw the police arriving, I should have stood firm in defending you as our valued guests. Instead, I let fear for my business override my moral obligation to protect innocent people." Sarah, still emotional from the trauma her family had endured, looked at Mitchell with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Mr. Mitchell, we've been coming to this resort for 3 years. We've spent thousands of dollars here, recommended you to our friends, treated your staff with respect and kindness, and the moment we needed you to stand up for us, you abandoned us to protect your business interests." Mitchell nodded, accepting the criticism he deserved. "You're absolutely right, Dr. Williams. There's no excuse for my behavior. But I want to do everything in my power to make this right. Pine Lake Resort will be implementing new policies immediately. Mandatory implicit bias training for all staff, a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory behavior, and a commitment to protecting all guests regardless of their race or background." He paused, then continued. "Furthermore, your family's stay this weekend will be completely complimentary, and we would like to offer you free accommodations for the next 5 years as a small gesture of our commitment to earning back your trust. We will also be making a substantial donation to civil rights organizations in your honor." While Mitchell's offers were generous, they couldn't undo the trauma that had been inflicted on the Williams family. Money and free vacations couldn't erase the memory of Jake crying in terror, or Emma having to defend her family against racist attacks, or Marcus being handcuffed like a criminal in front of his children. But Marcus, drawing on the wisdom that comes from 15 years of federal service and a lifetime of facing adversity with grace, saw an opportunity to turn this tragedy into something meaningful. He gathered his family close and walked toward the crowd of resort guests and news reporters who were still processing what they had witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak on this subject, "what you witnessed here tonight is not an isolated incident. This is the reality that Black families face every single day in America. We are questioned, suspected, and treated as threats simply because of the color of our skin." The crowd, which had been noisy and chaotic throughout the evening, fell completely silent as Marcus continued. "My family and I have been fortunate tonight because I had the resources, the connections, and the authority to fight back. But think about all the families who don't have those advantages. Think about all the Black fathers who have been humiliated in front of their children with no FBI director to call for help. Think about all the black mothers who have watched their dignity being stripped away with no federal agents coming to their rescue. Marcus's words cut through the night air like a sword, forcing everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they lived in. Racism exists at every level of our society, Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger and more passionate. It exists in police departments, in schools, in hospitals, in corporate boardrooms, and yes, even in upscale resorts like this one. It hides behind policies and procedures, behind claims of just following protocol and just doing our jobs. But racism without resistance is racism that thrives. He looked directly at the resort guests who had remained silent during his family's ordeal. Every single one of you had the power to speak up tonight. Every one of you could have demanded that Officer Reynolds examine my credentials. Every one of you could have called out the racist comments being made by other guests. Every one of you could have stood up for justice, instead of treating our humiliation like entertainment. The weight of Marcus's words visibly affected many in the crowd. Some people looked ashamed, others appeared to be genuinely reflecting on their own behavior, and a few were openly crying as they realized their complicity in what had happened. But here's what I want you to remember, Marcus said, his voice softening but losing none of its power. Today you witnessed something that happens all too often in America, but you also witnessed the power of truth, the importance of persistence, and the reality that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still prevail. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? As Marcus finished speaking, his daughter Emma stepped forward, and what she said next would have made any parent proud. "Dad," Emma said, her voice clear and strong despite the tears in her eyes. "Watching what happened to you tonight, seeing how you handled yourself with such dignity and strength, and witnessing the courage it took to stand up against injustice, it's made me more determined than ever to become a civil rights lawyer." She turned to address the crowd directly. "I'm 16 years old, and I've just seen my hero, my father, treated like a criminal for the crime of being black in America. But I've also seen him refuse to be broken by hate, refuse to respond with anger, and use this terrible experience to educate others about the reality of racism." Emma's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I'm going to spend my life fighting the kind of injustice that happened here tonight. I'm going to use the law to protect families like mine, to hold bad officers accountable, and to make sure that no child ever has to watch their parent being humiliated the way I did tonight." The maturity, eloquence, and moral courage of this 16-year-old girl left the entire crowd speechless. Here was a young woman who had just experienced trauma that would have broken many adults, and she was already channeling that pain into a commitment to fight for justice. But perhaps the most heartwarming moment of the entire evening came when 12-year-old Jake, who had been quietly processing everything that had happened, tugged on his father's sleeve and asked the question that brought smiles to faces that had been marked by tears and anger all night. "Daddy," Jake said, his voice filled with the wonder that only children can possess, "are you really like a secret agent, like in the movies?" Marcus knelt down to his son's eye level, and the smile that crossed his face was the first genuine moment of joy anyone had seen from him all evening. "Well, buddy," Marcus said, his voice warm with paternal love, "I'm not exactly like the secret agents in the movies. I don't have a fancy car that turns into a submarine, and I don't have gadgets that shoot lasers, but I do have something even better." Jake's eyes widened with curiosity. "What's that, Daddy?" "I have a badge that means I get to help people," Marcus explained. "I get to catch the real bad guys, the ones who hurt children, who steal from families, who try to scare good people, and most importantly, I get to come home every night to the most amazing family in the world." Jake's face lit up with pride. "So you're like a superhero, but a real one." Marcus laughed, and the sound was like music after the darkness of the previous hours. "I guess you could say that, son. But you know what? The real superheroes are people like your mom, who saves children's lives in the hospital, and your sister, who's going to grow up to fight for justice, and even brave little boys like you who ask good questions and aren't afraid to show love for their families. The interaction between father and son reminded everyone present that beneath all the politics, beneath all the anger and injustice and systemic problems, there were real families, real children, real human beings whose lives were affected by the choices that adults make about how to treat each other. As the Williams family prepared to finally return to their cabin for what remained of their weekend vacation, Marcus took one final opportunity to address the crowd with a message that would resonate far beyond Pine Lake Resort. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said, holding his wife's hand while his children stood beside him, "I want to leave you with this thought. Racism exists at every level of our society, but truth and justice will always prevail when good people find the courage to stand up and speak out." He paused, looking directly into the news cameras that would carry his words to viewers across the nation. What happened here tonight was wrong, but it was also an opportunity for all of us to examine our own hearts, to confront our own biases, and to commit ourselves to building a society where every family, regardless of the color of their skin, can enjoy a simple vacation without fear of harassment or humiliation. Marcus's final words were both a challenge and a promise. The fight for justice is not just the responsibility of law enforcement or civil rights lawyers or political leaders. It's the responsibility of every single person who believes that all human beings deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The question is not whether racism exists. We all saw that it does. The question is what each of us is going to do about it. As the Williams family finally walked away from the nightmare that had consumed their evening, the crowd began to disperse. But the impact of what they had witnessed would last far longer than a single night. Some would go home and forget about what they had seen, returning to their comfortable lives without changing anything about how they viewed the world. But others would be transformed by what they had witnessed, carrying with them a new understanding of the reality of racism and a new commitment to being part of the solution. The story could have ended there, with the family returning to their cabin and trying to salvage what remained of their vacation. But the real impact of this incident was just beginning to unfold. 3 weeks later, Marcus Williams stood in front of a room full of FBI agents at the Bureau's training facility in Quantico, Virginia. He was there, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as an instructor teaching one of the most important lessons any law enforcement officer can learn. "The night at Pine Lake Resort taught me something I thought I already knew," Marcus told his fellow agents. "I thought that my badge, my years of service, my federal credentials would protect me and my family from the kind of treatment that too many Americans face every day. I was wrong." He clicked to the next slide in his presentation, which showed a photo of his family taken just hours before their encounter with Officer Reynolds. 4 happy people excited about their weekend getaway, completely unaware of the nightmare that awaited them. "But being wrong about that taught me something even more valuable," Marcus continued. "It taught me that no black person in America, no matter how successful, how educated, how accomplished, is immune from racism. And if that's true for an FBI agent, imagine what it's like for families who don't have federal backup coming to rescue them." The room full of agents sat in stunned silence as Marcus continued his presentation, using his own traumatic experience to train other law enforcement officers about the reality of implicit bias, the importance of proper procedures, and the devastating impact that racist policing has on innocent families. "The goal of this training," Marcus concluded, "is not to make you feel guilty about the color of your skin or the badge you carry. The goal is to make you conscious of the biases we all carry, to help you recognize when those biases might be affecting your judgment, and to give you the tools to ensure that you treat every person you encounter with the dignity and respect they deserve." It was a powerful ending to a story that had begun with hatred and injustice, but had evolved into something much more meaningful. A lesson about resilience, about the power of truth, and about the possibility of turning even the darkest experiences into opportunities for education and growth. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think differently about racism, about justice, about the importance of speaking up when you witness injustice, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and share this story with others who need to hear it. And here's my final question for you. After everything you've witnessed in this story, what concrete action will you take the next time you see someone being treated unfairly because of their race? Will you speak up? Will you intervene? Will you be part of the solution? Let me know in the comments, because the Williams family's story is just one example of something that happens every single day in America. And it's up to all of us to decide whether we're going to be bystanders or champions of justice.